These are some scary neighbor stories. We lived in a very wide trash trailer park. A neighbor man that lived in a trailer across the street had a stash can fire pit and somehow convinced 6-year-old me to sit with him and talk with him until after dark while he was drunk at the fire pit. So when I got up to leave, he begged me to stay, and I told him I was going to check in and come back. Ran home and stayed in the house a lot for the rest of the time we lived there. He turned out to be a murderer. Killed the dude next door for screwing his wife, and he hid the hammer under his kitchen sink. My brother left me in his best friend's basement with his best friend's creepy dad for half an hour when I was 4. I remember sitting on the floor, very uncomfortable, and I had what I know now as a red flag screaming to watch him. The man sat there and talked to me about how he was in love with my mom and how much I looked like her. Well, I was so freaking scared. I didn't know what rape or anything was at the time, but I knew that I had to keep my guard up because I got that vibe that he'd hurt me. At the same trailer park as the first story now that I remember actually, I went to stay the night with a friend. It was me and the guy from the first stories. 16-year-old daughter, she was special needs. Had the mind of someone that was our age. When we got there, the girl we were staying with explained to us that her dad had just gotten out of prison for his 12-year-old cousin. Then I met the dude, and alarms began absolutely screaming, and he stared very uncomfortably at the special needs girl. Sat in the corner of her bed and watched the door all night while the other 2 girls slept. I'm scared to let my daughter stay the night with people now. So the next story is this one. So again, mind your surroundings. There was this old guy who lived with his wife and his dog a few doors away in a big house. He rarely left his home, but when he did, he only took his dog for a walk. He also talked very rarely and seemed to avoid other people, while his wife was somewhat more social. Well, the couple lived on our street for a few years and everything appeared to be fine. However, someday they divorced and the lady moved away for reasons unknown. The old guy remained with the dog in his house, and a few years passed. Well, there was never really anything suspicious or something, and aside from his usual strange behavior, everything seemed pretty normal. One morning, that was approximately 9 or 7 years ago, I don't remember, I left as usual my house to of course catch the school bus. Our street is relatively quiet and normally there isn't much stuff going on, but this morning though, that was a bit different. There were a few neighbors on the street and my parents said that there must be something wrong with the old guy, which lived on the street on the end of our street, right? But nothing specific was known. So I didn't really pay attention and I went to school and I really didn't thought much about it. As I returned and excited the bus at the bus stop, I saw it and then I saw that the whole street was cordoned off and evacuated. Police cars and officers were everywhere and even a SWAT team was there. I had no idea what was going on. I met up with my parents and they explained to me that the old guy, right, the one that lived over there, he tried to commit suicide and planned to take the whole street with him. He flooded his entire basement with gasoline and had an improvised bomb in his garden shed, which was essentially a big pile of propane gas tanks tied together. A timer clock and a toaster served as the fuse mechanism for both the bomb and the basement. Wow, so the whole thing, right, was rigged to explode between 7 and 8 a.m. in the morning. A smaller version of this explosive was placed in the trash bin of the guys who lived next to the maniac. Wow, obviously. It was something personal. Before the old man triggered the bomb, he wrecked the entire interior of his house with an axe and then went to the garage with his poor little dog, locked the gate, and turned his car engine on. He put his dog in the trunk and seated himself in the driver's seat, waiting to die from asphyxiation before he would be blown to pieces. Well, luckily, the plan didn't work out because a neighbor heard the car engine and became suspicious. So he looked through the garage window and at first thought the man had a heart attack. So he broke the window and entered, only to see the man more or less conscious in his car. At first, he had no idea what was going on, but then he noticed the distinctive smell of gasoline. He broke the door to enter the house and discovered the mess the old man had created. The neighbor immediately called the cops, and the bomb squad took care of the explosive just in time. Unfortunately, the dog suffocated in the trunk and was already dead when the neighbor arrived. So then the authorities arrested the guy and put him in a psychiatric ward after the court process. He will remain there until the end of his life. The estimated blast radius of the bomb would have been sufficient enough to destroy several houses and do severe damage to the surrounding area. So here is another story. Well, my aunt, she lives next door to us, which would be all fine, but she is a sociopath. The house we lived in was hers and my father growing up, and we, well, that's me, my dad, my mother and brother, moved in with my grandmother. That was about 10 years ago. My aunt would come get my nan's keys to fill her car with gas and copy the house key. My aunt would then come into the house in the wee hours of the morning and steal the stupidest things. We didn't notice for a while, but then our new shampoo bottles would be empty suddenly, our paper towels and toilet paper would be gone, our food, silverware and cups would be gone. Then my mom's jewelry would be on the stairs coming down from the bedrooms, like it was dropped on the way. One morning, I was wide awake. It was around 2:30 a.m. for some reason, and I heard what I assumed was one of my parents coming upstairs, going in their bedroom across the hall. Then a few minutes later, going back downstairs. The dog's tail was wagging and hitting the floor, so I wasn't scared until the next morning when my parents asked if I was up late that night and came in their room. The thing was, she didn't sneak up or tiptoe or anything, straight up stomped in and went upstairs, down the hall. She had done this many times and my dog was used to her coming in, and he wasn't really a good guardian, but never mind that. We then changed the locks and put a special code for the staircase, since she couldn't go upstairs to watch us sleep anymore. She would come around 5 or 6 in the morning just before my mom and I got up for school. Our alarms would go off at 5:45 a.m. on the weekdays, and we would only hear the front door slam shut. And if we ran to the windows, we would see her going back to her house. We changed the locks again, and at night, visits seemed to stop. I couldn't go on with more shit like this. Didn't this be enough? Well, so when I was about 10, it was close to Valentine's Day, and she told me this was the last holiday that she was going to give me candy because I was getting a bit fat. Right, that's what she said. And the whole family was concerned for my health. Also, whenever we went on vacation, we would have to lock up all our valuables, that is, purses, paintings and furniture. And when we got back, several knickknacks things would be gone. One time, a painting my father gave my dad was gone, and we were really pissed off about that. We knew she had been in the house because a family picture of my mom's would be on the floor or face down on the mantel. Eventually, my grandmother got Alzheimer's, and when my nan first went to the hospital, she gave my aunt her wedding rings, and those are long gone. She never gave them back. Absolutely heartbreaking to explain over and over to my grandmother that her own daughter stole her wedding ring. When my aunt visited Nan, she would pivot through her drawers and steal anything or everything of value. One day I was helping my grandmother get dressed and she cried because she didn't have any more jewelry because my aunt stole it. Another morning, while my grandmother was quickly succumbing to her Alzheimer's, my aunt came over at 5 a.m. to give her coffee, which we had already done. I am super hammered right now, and I hope that it made sense. So, thanks for the brief internet fame. So this story might surprise you. Well, actually, my family and I were the creepy neighbors. My single mother and I and my siblings moved into the middle-class neighborhood when I was about 12 years old. I am the oldest, by the way. My mother managed to score a great deal on an apartment in a two-family apartment house. We were dirt poor, on welfare, and my mother was a mentally ill, abusive psychopath. Well, the other residents in the neighborhood were relatively normal, middle-class people. Financially, many were quite comfortable or even rich. We were the poorest people in the neighborhood. We were the only kids being raised by a single parent. Every other kid in the neighborhood, and there were dozens upon dozens of kids, were all being raised by a two-parent family. We were the only welfare recipients in the neighborhood. Being poor, we could hardly afford groceries, forget about eating out. Hunger was a constant companion, while all the other kids ate regularly. Well, in the summertime, when the ice cream man came, driving down our street, all the other neighborhood kids and the parents would buy themselves ice cream every day. Well, me and my siblings could only stand there and watch all the kids purchasing and enjoying their ice cream. The worst part of it all was having a mentally ill, screaming, raving maniac for a mother. Our mother screamed and yelled at us kids pretty much every day of the week. She used to put up a phony front to the neighbors, but they weren't fooled. Unbeknownst to my mother, our neighbor would hear her screaming, raving tirades outside the four walls of our apartment, especially during the summer when we had our windows open because we had no air conditioning. The neighbors would remark to us kids, "Boy, your mother sure does yell at a lot." Mother had not a single friend amongst our neighbors. One day, I was hanging out with some of the neighborhood kids. We were all the way up the block, far away from my place. We weren't doing much of anything, just talking, when all of a sudden the sound of my mother's screaming voice filled the air. Evidently, she was yelling at one of my siblings. All the other kids fell countless times before, but it was the first time for me. Finding out that my mother's screaming voice could be heard outdoors by the neighbors, and so far away from the apartment too, well, I was mortally embarrassed. It was my kind of bittersweet that the neighbor knew. Sweet because some people outside the family knew what a mentally ill, abusive, screaming maniac she really was. Bitter because there was nothing they could do or would do to save us kids from the hell we lived in. Well, this is kind of a long story to tell, but I think it is important. So, I live in Texas with my daughter Alicia and my son Jay, 4 months old, and Alicia is 8. And their mother has been out of the picture for the past 2 years, not dead, just a piece of, And I've managed pretty well as a single father. The 3 of us lived in a 2-bedroom in a nice neighborhood. I've got a solid job and the kids are thankfully healthy. Well, everything was smooth sailing until one night, 2 months ago approximately, during which I was awoken by Jay poking me in the face. He was sobbing violently, though I realized and recognized that it was the "I'm afraid" kind of crying, as opposed to the one "I'm hurt" crying, which made me a little less worried. Jay's always been nightmare prone. I assumed that was causing his distress. When I asked him what was wrong, he said, "The man in the next house is making scary faces at me." I'd heard my fair share of Jay's stories about monsters terrorizing him from the dark corners of his bedroom, but this was something new. I assumed he meant our neighbor's house, and the lack of fantastical elements in his description made me uneasy. It felt too specific to be one of his unusual nightmares. I got out of the bed and walked with Jay in tow to my kids' room. Alicia was awake in the top bunk. From soft glow of their night, I could see her crossing her arms and scrolling down at her little brother. I didn't turn on the lights to give myself a better view of the outdoors, and I peered out the bedroom window. Their window had curtains on it, but for once they hadn't been drawn all the way, and there was a small opening between them, though which Jay must have locked out. One side of the neighbor's house, the one to our left from the street, was visible from Alicia and Jay's room. There were 2 windows on the neighbor's side of the house, but it was too dark inside to see anything. I recalled from what I had seen in the daylight that the window on the left, the one closest to the front of the house, was the kitchen. I wasn't sure what the window on the right was, as it always had curtains down. So I asked Alicia if she had seen anything, and she looked and shook her head. He's always having nightmares and crying. I don't want to share a room with him anymore, Dad. I never get any sleep. It is not fair. Well, of course, after hearing that, Jay started crying again, so I let him sleep. Honestly, at that point, I half suspected his nightmare to be a ploy to get me to let him camp, Anyway, I guess that I'm a total pushover because he slept in that tent in my room for the next 2 nights. On the 3rd night, though, I was again woken up, but this time by Alicia, who was standing over me and shaking my arm. That kid hadn't woken me up in the middle of the night for years. When I asked her what was wrong, she said, "The neighbor was making faces at me." Those words and the fear in my daughter's voice really put me on edge. I closed the curtains when I said goodnight. "Well, did you open them?" "Only a little, but it's because I heard a weird voice." "What did you hear?" Alicia couldn't really recall exactly. According to her, she had gotten out of bed to see what was going on, and when she left and lifted the curtain, she saw a light on in the neighbor's window. The curtains in the back of the room had been drawn back, and our neighbor was standing in his house, right up against the window frame. So, what was he doing? Alicia thought for a moment and then made an expression I never want to see on my child's face, or anyone else's for that matter, ever again. I won't do it justice by describing it, but it looks like something like this. Well, first she smiled with both sets of her teeth. So then there was like a little open silver between the rows, and then she furrowed her eyebrows. She inclined her head towards me, kind of Kubrick stare-esque, and strained the muscles in her neck. The worst part, though, was what she did with her hands. She held out her left arm and her forearm up. Then she clenched her right hand into a fist and moved it back and forth rapidly over her forearm. Poor thing, described it as. Was playing a violin, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that my neighbor was pantomime cutting. Disturbed, I told Alicia to stop and not to make either the expression or the gesture ever again. I was angry and confused. My neighbor, a man in his 40s, was a bit of a recluse, but he had seemed normal enough in the 3 or 4 times that I'd spoken to him. I couldn't fathom why he would do something like that to my kids. After asking Alicia a few more questions, I realized that my neighbor might not have done anything technically or, well, at least legally wrong. It wasn't against the law to make inappropriate gestures of cutting in your own home, but it seemed like he was targeting my kids especially. Legal or not, I had planned to have a little chat with him the following morning. My last question to Alicia was, well, tell me, if our neighbor had made any other gestures, and she nodded. Well, then she started making beckoning come here motions with both of her hands. I had Alicia sleep in my room for the night as well. I also checked out the window in my kids' room, but like before, I saw nothing. The house was completely dark. The next morning, before work, and after dropping Alicia and Jay to school, I spent a good 5 minutes knocking at my neighbor's front door. I figured he was home since his car was in the driveway, but he never answered the door. Eventually, I had to leave for work, and as I was walking away, I turned around quickly to see if he was watching me. He was, the coward. I saw him for a split second at the front window before he ducked beneath the sill and out of the view. Clearly, the guy had problems. He yelled out to him to stop messing with us, and then I left. That same night, I put a plan in motion. While my kids slept in the room, I hung out in theirs. It was a Friday night, and I was ready to pull an all-nighter so that I could catch my neighbor in the action. Although I trusted my kids, I wanted to confirm that there was actually something nefarious going on before it escalated. I made sure the house was locked up and all the curtains drawn, took my kids in, and sat on the floor under the window of their room. At around 9, I started marathoning midnight mass on my phone. I didn't want to wear headphones and miss any strange sounds, so I kept the volume low and mostly read subtitles. At midnight, I started to hear strange sounds, like Alicia said. Well, it is a bit hard to describe, but I can do is that it was so low, repeated clicking sounds, like the sound you make to the back of a horse. It was something like that. All I knew is that the sound was undoubtedly coming from a person. After a few minutes of this, the sound twitched to what I think was supposed to be a whistle, but it came out all wrong, like someone sucking beneath through their teeth. The sound was so crisp that the neighbor's window must have been open, which was an unsettling thought, given that there was only around 15 feet of space between our houses. Certain that the neighbor was at his window, and this was my best chance to see him, I stood up and pulled the curtain back in one motion. I saw him right away. There was a dim light on in his room, allowing me to see the horrible expression Alicia had made the night before. It was one thing to see my child's recreation, but it was far more frightening on an adult. His window was indeed open, and his arms were stuck out into the cold night, violently swiping against each other in a grotesque mimicry of self-harm. When he saw me, and realizing that he was looking at another grown man, and not some poor child, he stopped his erratic motions. His cartoonish grin faded, and another, more genuine emotion settled over his features. It was rage. Well, the man grabbed the window and slammed it shut, then closed the curtains with the same forcefulness. I let my own curtain fall. I was a little shell-shocked, I think. Of course, I was perturbed by the sight of the man, but his face and his movement and the fact that he had been doing that for who knows how many nights, and now an attempt to frighten my kids. However, another detail stuck out as even more concerning to me, which was the fact that I genuinely wasn't like sure if I had seen it was my neighbor. I'd seen him so few times in the past years that, well, though I lived next to that house, I wasn't really meeting him, and I was having trouble conjuring up his face. So as I sat on the floor for a minute, my blood thundering in my ears, I definitely had enough evidence at this point to call the cops, right? Just as I was about to pull out my phone, I heard a tremendous smack against the glass of the bedroom window. After a brief hesitation, I pulled the curtains back again. There were no lights on the neighbor's house, and there was also no one outside from what I could see. I pulled the curtains back a little further and saw a handprint in the top of the corner of the window page. While it is worth noting that our house is on raised foundation and that particular window is very tall, so even though the window is on the first floor, the man outside would have been needed an insane vertical to get his hand up there. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 as I explained the situation to them. I quickly walked around the house to see if I could catch a glimpse of the man. My last stop was the bedroom. Once inside, I locked the doors while still on the phone with the operator. I took my handgun out for the safe in the safe of my closet. My heart was beating out of my damn chest, but I knew I had to stay calm. Even more so when I saw that Alicia was awake and looking out the tent at me. I reassured her in as few words as I could, whispering that we were okay and we just had to stay very quiet. I sat on the edge of my bed, my firearm ready and my ears straining. My kid's tent was in the corner to the left of the tent, in the middle of the wall, and directly across from where I sat was a window. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something. It was a cloudless night, and the moonlight was bright enough that I could see a silhouette through the white curtains. The dark shape was nebulous at first, but became more clear as the man outside stepped closer to the window. Somehow he knew which room we were in. The silhouette didn't move for several minutes, and I remember being thankful that, from the angle which I was sat in, Alicia couldn't see it. Then something happened that I couldn't entirely wrap my head around. The man stepped back from the glass and raised his arms, making a Y shape with his body and his limbs. Only his arms were far too long. They seemed to be double the length that they could have been, each arm about the same length as his entire body. I thought at first that he was holding something, maybe two pipes that just appeared to be an extension of his limbs, but I could clearly see two hands at the ends of the two extremities. I could see 5 fingers on each hand, flopping around slightly as the man brought his arms closer to the window. Dot, dot, dot. I stood up and readied myself to shoot, but just then the sound of the sirens pierced the quiet night. The man outside banged his hands against the window one last time, and then it was as if something had sliced his arms at the elbows. His forearms seemed to shear right off, and the man took off running because they so much hit the ground. When the police officers announced themselves, I answered the door and explained the situation to them. 2 officers, a man and a woman, asked me a few questions about my neighbor, which I assume was necessary to establish probable cause for the search. Once finished, they told me to stay inside with the doors locked while they investigate the neighbor's house. I watched them through the window of Alicia and Jay's room. They knocked on the door of the neighbor, and when no one answered, they tried the front door handle. I watched the unlocked door swipe open, and the two looked at one another and then entered. I am not sure what they found inside that house. All I know is that they emerged a few moments later. They both looked very disturbed. When I went outside to ask what they have found, the female officer told me simply, "Your neighbor is dead." The rest of the night was a blur, strangers in uniforms filling in and out of my neighbor's home. Some came to my porch afterwards to ask me questions, and none offered me any answers. They moved with tight-lipped efficiency, their faces guarded, their words clipped. At one point, I wanted to go to the house and found several people photographing something on the ground outside my bedroom window. Before they could ask me to leave, I made out the gruesome shape of two human arms. The kids and I have been staying at my parents' apartment for months, and I think everyone, even Jay, is getting tired of the cramping living situation. We can't stay in that house. Alicia is way too traumatized for that, and I would be very uncomfortable staying there while the murder is still at large away. I want to sell the house, but our story going semi-viral is making that very difficult. After all, we would want a house that, who would want that, right? Has become permanently associated with phrases like dismemberment and days of torture and victim barely recognizable as human. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed these few stories, and don't forget to leave a like to support the channel. Consider subscribing.